times. Today's topic is the economic rise of India and its global implications. I'm the host of today's episode, Talal Rafi. I'm an economist and an expert member of the World Economic Forum. So since its independence in 1947, India has followed a path of non-alignment. Its economy was inward-looking and did not project fast growth. In 1991, India opened its economy with many tough reforms coming in. This has led to India growing rapidly. India is currently the fastest growing major economy in the world. It is the third largest economy by purchasing power parity and is set to be the third largest economy in terms of GDP in a few years. So India is the world's most populous nation, and its economic rise will have global implications. India is attracting large investments from around the world. India, being a democracy, can also shift the global narrative back to economic advancement being associated with democratic values. Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian is the executive director of the International Monetary Fund, and he is the former chief economic advisor to the Indian government. As chief economic advisor, Dr. Subramanian conceptualized India's economic policy during the once-in-a-century COVID pandemic. By correctly identifying COVID as a huge supply-side shock, Dr. Subramanian balanced supply and demand-side measures, transformed fiscal policy to focus on public capital expenditures, and initiated path-breaking reforms to address structural problems. His foresight and vision enabled the Indian economy to emerge with high growth and strong macro fundamentals despite the Ukraine war following the pandemic. Acknowledging Dr. Subramanian's contribution, the Honorable Prime Minister of India noted his academic brilliance, unique perspectives on economic and policy matters, and reformatory zeal. His understanding of the Indian economy and the wider global economic landscape will help us understand the global implications of India's economic rise. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Subramanian. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure, and a very warm greetings to everybody.
Thank you. So let me start off with a broader question. Where is India's economy today, and what is the way forward in your view?
Talal, as you pointed out, India is the fifth largest economy now in dollar terms and the third largest in purchasing power parity terms. I am in the process of writing a book titled India at 100, where my prognosis is that with good policy and a little bit of luck, if things go our way very well, by the time India is 100 years old in 2047, India could be the global titan in the economic landscape.
That's brilliant. I think it's going to have a lot of positive impact around the world. And so to go off to the second question, I mean, you authored the strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy. So that was in 2018, 2019. And you were also the economic advisor to the Indian government during one of the toughest times, COVID pandemic. So it was a unique challenge, and I think you did a great job. So how far have the goals of the blueprint that you put been achieved right now? Of course, there were a few setbacks with the economic crisis and COVID. So with that, still, how far do you think they have been achieved?
So that's a very good question, Talal. There are a few aspects that I want to touch upon here. As you rightly pointed out, the COVID pandemic was a setback globally, with GDP growth declining by about 4.5% in the COVID year. India had a decline as well, but India converted that crisis into an opportunity by pursuing sui generis economic policy. India, in contrast to all other economies, including the advanced ones, identified the COVID crisis very correctly as a big supply side shock, and therefore recognized that with a big supply side shock, if the demand side measures are too large, then there'll be runaway inflation. And India had the experience during the previous crisis, the global financial crisis, of imitating the policies of the advanced economies by implementing, as a percentage of GDP, almost a similar stimulus that the advanced economies had. And that led to runaway inflation, in fact, double-digit inflation every month for 18 months with a peak of 18%. And remember, this was without a supply-side shock. The global financial crisis was not a supply-side shock. You're an economist, you can overlay and think about the counterfactual, which is what, as policymakers, we had to think about. if we had done the same thing as during the global financial crisis, mimicking the advanced economies, at the supply side shock, I recognize that we would have been looking at 20% plus inflation for at least 2 years. And that would have broken the back of the economy. Of course, that would have led to significant macroeconomic volatility, like the fragile five that India was part of. India became part of because of bad policy during the global financial crisis. India could have faced similar economic troubles. In contrast, by identifying the crisis correctly and thereby coming up with a good balance of measures that catered to both the supply side and the demand side of the economy, India really was able to emerge very strongly from the COVID pandemic. And here it is important to recognize, unlike in the case of advanced economies, India entered the pandemic with a twin problem in some sense, caught between a rock and a hard place. Why? Because growth had been declining before the COVID pandemic, and that was because of the financial sector problems, that was created by a lot of crony lending. This led to rating agencies downgrading India's outlook, and India was barely at the investment grade. And remember, this decline happened because of declining growth. So if there was a further decline in growth post-COVID, India would have actually faced the possibility of a ratings downgrade to non-investment grade, and there would have been significant capital flight. At the same time, because India doesn't have the luxury of a reserve currency, for instance, India could not go and spend exorbitantly. Therefore, every taxpayer buck, the value of that had to be maximized, and that's where the India's policy was designed very carefully by using the financial sector. We financial economists typically think about adverse selection and moral hazard as big problems in financial markets. By overlaying guarantees, for loans given by banks to the small and medium enterprises, and by the microfinance institutions to the urban poor, India ensured that what is generally an adverse selection problem was converted into a favorable selection, thereby really targeting the stimulus. As a result, India spent, judiciously, but at the same time ensured that the intervention was very sharp and well directed, which is why now India has emerged with very strong macroeconomic fundamentals and also, a strong growth. And that is reflected in the rating agencies, some of them actually now, providing an upgrade on India's economic outlook. So it is really important to understand this aspect of policy. Now, let me come to the second aspect, which is the question that you asked about the $5 trillion economy. It was important to understand India's sui generis policy, which is what underlies my prognosis for the future. But if you go back to that $5 trillion economy, the economic strategy that we had laid out, it was by analyzing very carefully all the economies that had grown at least at 5% in real terms, but not just for 1 year or 2 years, for at least a decade. So, every year in the decade, at least 5%. And, the East Asian economies, China stand out as examples, but there were also periods, for instance, Japan, West Germany after the Second World War. These are all examples of such high growth. By examining the macroeconomic policy that they followed and recognizing that at the macroeconomic level, macroeconomic variables like investment, consumption, job creation, aggregate demand, these are all both causes and effects, and in a dynamic sense, which means that investment, this year can affect consumption and thereby aggregate demand next year. And aggregate demand next year can, affect investment in the subsequent year. And therefore, when you look at, in the time series, you have each of these macroeconomic variables being both a cause and an effect. And therefore, it was very important to study carefully what is that key driver, in some sense, that first pin that creates the domino effect for, the economy to go into a virtuous cycle. This is where we identified, by carefully studying all these countries over the last 1 century that had grown at least at 5% for at least a decade, we identified that it was because of the virtuous cycle driven by private investment. In other words, private investment was essentially that first pin that created the domino effect for all the other macroeconomic variables to actually move in a virtuous cycle, but at an accelerated pace. And here we recognized, as I just mentioned, the cause and effect, and so one had to do scholarly research, to disentangle these causes and effects, and thereby, really find out what is that key variable. So, through the use of theoretical research and that we took guidance from, and empirical research, we identified that it is private investment. Now, that underlay India's economic policy during COVID, when private sector was unlikely going to be invest, not only in India, but anywhere in the world because of risk aversion. And, India took the opportunity, therefore, to invest in public capital expenditure, especially in infrastructure. And here, infrastructure in power, logistics, including transport, including railways and roads. And these have been structural problems that have hobbled the Indian economy. And that is why the sovereign focused on these investments. Now, as we talk, and this has been covered in last year's economic survey as well, private investment is crowding in because of these infrastructural investments made by the sovereign. So bottom line, now, very recently, India's GDP exceeded 4 trillion. This economic strategy that was laid out, is starting to play out positively. And that is what makes me very optimistic that in the next 25 years, India will be the bellwether for global economic growth. And, with some amount of luck, we could be the global titan in the economic landscape.
Right. Thank you. Yes. And I was in Delhi earlier this year, and there's a lot of capital expenditure, like roads and all built. So that is sort of like, in a democracy, I felt that that's a good move by the government, because usually you see populist policies, handouts being given, but the government is investing in structures that, the benefits can come in a decade later. So was that also part of the plan?
Yes, here one has to give a lot of credit to the Honorable Prime Minister. You very correctly identified that there is a tendency in a democracy to resort to populism, thereby give away freebies and not invest in the in infrastructure. Those of us who have studied political economy recognize what is called the horizon problem. The fact that infrastructure investments, they pay off over a longer horizon, a horizon that is longer than any government's, and therefore it requires enormous vision to be able to go and implement it. But the vision is necessary, not sufficient. And here's where, again, credit has to be given to the Honorable Prime Minister. He is a fantastic communicator. In a democracy, it is extremely important to communicate the nuances of good economic policy to common citizens. Without that, you cannot get good economic policy in a democracy. In fact, as we talk, and here we must be making a distinction between some state governments that actually are resorting to populism and reckless populism by giving away freebies. In a recent election a few months back in the southern state of Karnataka, there were promises given of free passes to women for buses, free LPG cylinders, this thing free, that thing free. Those of us who are Bollywood fans will remember this movie 3 Idiots, where Amir Khan says free, 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 you remember? And that is basically the kind of populism that some of these governments are resorting to. And that, to me, is actually symptomatic of politicians who don't have a good understanding of economics, number one, and secondly, are not smart enough to be able to go and communicate nuances of economic policy to common citizens in a good way. And here's where, having worked very closely with the Honorable Prime Minister for 3 years, I have found him very sharp and very smart. He can understand things threadbare, without having to resort to jargon, and can go and explain this to the common population as well. And that is why he, is able to, do good economic policy and show that good economics can make for good politics, which is in contrast to several other politicians who actually are failing on this count.
Right, thank you. And, coming from Sri Lanka, what we found is the populist policies have led us down a not a really good path. But, there was a sort of an argument even a few years ago that, democracy really can't make countries progress forward. But you think like India's rise as an economic power brings back the argument that democracy can lead to economic growth in today's age? That argument away from, you needing authoritarian governments to do the hard reforms. But here it's an example of even a democratic country which can show the world an example.
Yes, but with an important nuance. As I mentioned, and in my answer to your previous question, currently we have a government at the center, a leader who understands the importance of good economics and who has the ability to not only understand the nuances, but also communicate the nuances of good economic policy to common citizens. My answer is a qualified yes, because I go back to the previous, the period from 2004 to 2014. What I have actually called it the lost decade. If for the benefit of our viewers, it is important to point out that up until around 2002, 2003, the previous government, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government, had done a lot of reforms. For instance, they had reformed the telecom sector. They had, invested, much like the current government, they had invested in roads. The Golden Quadrilateral was built at that time, and as a result of the lagged effect of such reforms and the infrastructure spending, growth was very good in the first term of from 2004 to 2014. Of course, it was also a time before the global financial crisis when the global economy was doing very well. And we economists know very well that, a rising tide lifts all boats, and that was the manifestation. So, but economic policy was dreadful, during that period and since then as well. Again, illustrating that, if you have a leader who doesn't have the spine to be able to take these risks, to be able to go and communicate to the masses the importance of good economic policy, then democracy cannot necessarily be, a good vehicle for economic progress. It can lead to a lot of, welfare spending and freebies, but it doesn't necessarily expand the pie. And I think if you see a lot of, populist governments, they end up giving these freebies, but don't necessarily end up growing the pie. And if you don't have a growing pie, you can't do enough welfare spending either. And this is the other thing to remember, actually, in the last 9 to 10 years, there's been enormous, inclusive development as well. For instance, and this is something that has been shown through very careful research. If you take the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, the Clean, India campaign, because of which many, in fact, almost 100% of villages have now become open defecation free. What that has done is that it has reduced diarrhea deaths, it has reduced, malaria deaths and these waterborne diseases, because, water that gets contaminated because of bad sanitation itself leads to diseases. Similarly, if you look at the housing campaign that has been what is called the Awas Yojana, that has created so many houses at the bottom of the pyramid. Similarly, if you take the digitization, and this is a story that I love telling, in India today, if you want to go and drink a sort of a piece of coconut water, something that you get in Sri Lanka, not in these canned ones, but the fresh ones, right? So you will pay about $50 for that. You can just pull out your phones. I can pull out my phone and pay, the $50, 50 cents, to the seller. And this is someone who actually doesn't have a shop. He just has a cart, who actually and stores those raw coconuts in that cart. Not just that, a couple of months back, I was in India and I went to buy vegetables with my mom, in the local mandi there, actually, this is in a place like called Chandigarh. I went there. and the local, fruit seller, the local vegetable seller, he's taking, digital money as well. So we bought some potatoes for like 17 rupees and he didn't have change. And therefore I just pulled out my phone and gave him 17 rupees instead of having to find out change, give him, and that's the kind of, change that is happening. Think about the inclusivity that this brings, because this particular vegetable seller or the fruit seller can now go to the bank and show his digital records and say, look, this is what I earn in a month. When it was cash based, he couldn't have gone and said, look, I earn 50,000 rupees a month, so you actually give me a loan. But now he can go and the bank has the information to be able to give him credit. So that's the kind of inclusive development that is happening. So to summarize, what I actually want to say is a democracy needs visionary leaders, number one, but it also needs leaders who can go and explain the nuances of good economic policy to common citizens. And I think that is extremely important. So I would not say that democracy, in and itself, without the correct leader, will necessarily lead to economic growth. And I think India's experience from 2004 to 2014 is actually a brilliant example. There are similar examples. If you take another prime minister whom I have a lot of respect for, P.V. Narasimha Rao, who actually was from the same party, that governed from 2004 to 2014, but he had the vision to liberalize the economy. What you mentioned, in 1991, he understood really the importance of liberalization. So if you get good leaders who actually have the vision, number one, but also if they can go and articulate and sell that vision to the common population, then democracy sort of gives you, in some sense, a first best. But I think if you get leaders who actually are myopic, who don't understand the importance of good economic policy, and who don't have the ability to go and communicate, to the common people, then I think you get third best or fourth best. And I think in that case, maybe, a sort of a non-democratic government possibly is the second best from an economic perspective. Of course, when it comes to freedom, etc., those are different things, and I'm not getting into those aspects. So if only you got a visionary leader who can communicate, that good economics actually can make for good politics, and rise that, aspiration, among people, then you get that first best in a democracy, economic development, inclusive economic development, and of course with freedoms as well that democracy provides.
I understand. Yes. So also another question is that you've been living in the US even before you became an economic advisor. So with years there and in India, how do you compare the two economies? Like, does India have a strategic advantage, like something that the US doesn't? Any weaknesses, just to do a comparison of the two economies?
That's again a very good question, Talal. So let me share this experience. So I, came to the US for my PhD in 2001. And then after completing my PhD, I was a professor here, and then moved back to India in 2010. So I stayed for 9 years, at that time. And at that time, because I knew very well I would be going back to India, unlike many of my friends from undergrad who said, after Columbus, nobody ever who actually came to the United States went back. You're not going back. But I told them I will go back. Because I knew I was going to go back, I would actually keep comparing aspects of the US economy and look at and say, why is this aspect not there in India, for instance? So this comparative, analysis is something that used to keep going on in my mind and in discussions with friends, other friends as well. And one of the things that at that time I would notice was, or many things, not just one of the things, many things, where that, this good feature is there in the US, but not in India. So in general, I would look at the US economy, the US, and marvel, at why can't, the Indian economy become like that? That's a thought that, used to repeatedly strike me. Now, last year, I came here again to the United States, and, there's a big difference. Now I look at the US economy, and I look at and say, this is something that I can do so well in India, but I can't do it, in the US. And one of the key aspects there is essentially, inclusive growth through the public digital infrastructure. I gave you the example of, the kind of digitization. I cannot imagine, maybe going to a very small town, let's say in the United States, and somebody who's working in the informal sector. The informal sector is not very large in the US. Let's recognize for that, But suppose if there is an informal sector, somebody who's actually poor, using digital transactions, or me using, let's say a Zelle or Google Pay to actually make a payment to that vendor. I can't imagine that, but this is there in India today. So I think, when it comes to inclusive growth and creation of public digital infrastructure, I think India has leapfrogged the United States, significantly. And here, the nuance that I want to point out is that we, as economists, all of us, have been taught that when it comes to public goods like infrastructure, private sector will always underprovide for that, because the gestation periods, the kind of investment that is required, the risks that are involved are oftentimes not commensurate for the rewards that they would get, because there are lots of positive externalities that the private sector player cannot necessarily internalize, and that is why infrastructure should generally be created by the sovereign. Now, if you look at the United States, a lot of the digital goods have actually been created by the private sector. In contrast, in India, the digital infrastructure has been created by the sovereign. And this means a very important difference, because when private sector creates that kind of infrastructure, very likely that private sector player becomes a monopolist. And we know very well a monopoly will charge higher prices higher than what is economically optimal. Higher prices mean that those at the bottom of the pyramid in particular cannot access that particular piece of infrastructure or the services that are delivered using that infrastructure. As a result, access remains far more limited, and will be the case in the United States. In India, on the other hand, it actually will not be as as limited, because the sovereign has created that infrastructure and is pricing in a way that that every common citizen can avail it. The other important aspect, which is why actually I don't think that some of this financial infrastructure, digital infrastructure will happen in the United States, is because the financial sector as a lobby is very, very strong. And a lot of the profits they make are from fee-based activities. Like, I want to, let's say, send some money to you. So I pay $10 or maybe $20 or $30, and this is just fees that the financial sector is charging for intermediation. They're not going to actually let that go. And if you look at research, and there are papers showing that as well. In the US from 1990s onwards, if you look at the slope of the lobbying dollars that have been provided by the financial sector, that looks like a 40-degree line. The second best, till 1990s, it used to be the automobile sector that provided the maximum lobbying dollars. That dwarfs now, at about 15, at like a 15-degree line. So the financial sector lobby is so strong in the United States that the disruption that is required for public digital infrastructure, that is unlikely in the United States. And that's the other big change, the second big. The third, that is something which I actually want to highlight, is we spoke about the difference in economic policy during COVID, vis-a-vis, for instance, the United States. The United States, during COVID, wrote checks, $5,000 checks for everyone, every person, no targeting whatsoever. In fact, friends of my daughter who was studying at the University of Chicago then, my daughter didn't get it because she's an Indian citizen, but friends of hers in a private university got $5,000. That tells you how badly targeted the spending was. And I have I've written elsewhere that this basically led to savings, increasing significantly. For instance, from an average of about 13-14% of GDP, savings increased to about 25%. What that meant is that now this savings had to go and sit as deposits in the commercial bank portfolios. And because demand did not increase that much, so banks had to go and invest in the, in treasury securities and other agency securities, combined with the inflation that came about because of such profligate spending, which led to this significant increase in interest rates. These banks are sitting on close to 650 billion to 700 billion of unrealized losses. The discount window that the Fed created in March of 2023, that is essentially just kicking the can down the road. At some point, point in time, they have to unmount this tiger, and they can unmount it only when the interest rates come down significantly. Now, I'm using this as an example of politics becoming quite a sort of an important driver of economic policy, contrasting with, for instance, the Indian. I think that these are important aspects. That said, though, and this is the last point, a most important point that I'll mention. I always, would be very careful in betting against the United States on economic matters, because the best people from all over the world, come and they come to study here and work here. The United States gets the best talent from across the world. Therefore, it is something that one has to always keep in mind, and that difference is a very positive difference. India does not have it at this point in time. The best people from across the world certainly do not come to India; they come to the United States, and that is something which makes me always optimistic about the United States as well.
Right, thank you. And I think the United States got you. Moving on to talking about the US and India, I mean, the synergies. So you think the current geopolitical environment suits India? Because one thing is like with the US-China frictions going on, and at the same time, the US needing sort of like for maybe their own self-interest, needing a counterweight to China. And at the same time, you also find that Japan is also investing heavily in Indian tech startups. So there you have an aging population, and in India, you have a sort of a young population. So you think like playing into geopolitics also can sort of like India, I mean, it can rise without the need of other powers, but it can sort of like boost India's economic growth even greater.
So, Talal, I think we have to recognize that when it comes to geopolitics is always driven by self-interest, country self-interest. So, in previous cases, the Chinese growth, for instance, itself was driven by American self-interest at that point in time. Basically, they were able to outsource activities. So, I don't think, if countries support India, that will be because of their self-interest. It's not because of any other benign. So I think let's set that aside, that there is, always self-interest driving geopolitics. That said, let me highlight two key aspects that makes India a very, very trustworthy partner and a trustworthy leader as well. One, India has never ever in its history been an aggressor to any country. When other countries have undertaken aggression, India has defended itself very well, of course. But India has never ever been an aggressor, and that is something which will not change. I'm absolutely confident about that. Second, when it comes to international obligations, even in 1991, when India was facing its worst balance of payments crisis, India did not default on its obligations. India shipped gold to the Bank of England, to Bank of Japan, to get foreign currency as collateral, but did not default on its obligations. You can, contrast with other countries. These two aspects, the fact that India never ever is an aggressor, and that India will, always, respects its obligations, comes from its deep spiritual ethos. And having worked very closely in the government, I can see there is absolute bipartisan support for both these aspects, because that is something that is inherent to India's DNA, irrespective of the political spectrum. And that brings a certain vision in the way India thinks about. For instance, if you go back, in the Maha Upanishads, one of the treatises written, Upanishads are actually sacred scriptures, which basically talk about or discuss some of the most important questions that humankind has about the purpose of life, etc. In the Maha Upanishads, there is this shloka that comes, which basically, I'm going to say it in Sanskrit first and then translate it in English for our viewers. It goes as Ayam nijaha paro veti ganana laghu chetasam udara charitanam ta vasudaiva kutumbakam. So it basically goes as, this is mine and that is not mine. This kind of small-minded thinking, is indulged in only by those people who actually are indeed are small-minded. For those who are broad-minded, the entire world is a family, and that's the kind of ethos that has actually always permeated India's thinking, and especially policy makers, the intellectuals that contribute to policy making. This is something that is ingrained into us right from our very young age. So India, as an economic power and a leader in the globe, will be trusted, will be a trustworthy partner that very few countries can command, and that is because of the spiritual ethos. And let me add one more bit, which is basically, this is not economic, but anywhere in the world, when any person of any nationality, any race, any religion starts asking the question, why am I here on this planet? One country that they always think about is India. And I think that is because of our spiritual ethos. And it is this that actually gives us the kind of trust and the, and sort of elevated thinking that Indians, we always undertake, which is a huge benefit. And so going forward as well, India, will always be a responsible leader. If you look at several aspects like climate change, look at the G20, the recent G20, the kind of leadership that India displayed, is testimony to what I'm talking about. These are not esoteric concepts. These are actually, concepts that action in our policy. And that is why India will be a very responsible leader, as it grows, and its leadership will be always beneficial for the rest of the world, because it's, as I said, it's ingrained into us to think about the entire world as our family. So India's growth will always be a salutary one for the rest of the world.
Right. Yes, sir. And just talking on the topic, so what would be the sort of the implications if, let's say, India was to take the place of the US at the financial clout, the reserve currency of the world? Would it be like, in a positive way, like, for example, talking in a geopolitical terms, as the most populous country and being the largest democracy in the world, would, for example, India interfere in a country if you see a sort of a democracy being in trouble, or there is a sort of turmoil in that sense? Or will India use it responsibly only in economic terms? I mean, I'm saying interference in a positive way.
So, this question is a very speculative one, because you're asking me to speculate on multiple fronts. Let me be very honest and realistic here. Right now, any other currency replacing the dollar is something that is far away. I don't see it at this point in time. If we talk about, for instance, I mean, India is definitely working on this, but India's overall contribution to global trade has to increase significantly. The use of the rupee in global transactions will have to increase. Only when some of these conditionalities are fulfilled can we even start thinking about the question that you've asked. So I think while we are definitely working on this, I want to be very honest in saying that what you're thinking about is something that is far away. Be that as it may, because you've asked me this question, let me mention that.
I was saying in a hypothetical way.
Yes, of course. Of course, I would like to think that India, would not want to very actively interfere in other country matters. As I said earlier as well, India has never been an aggressor, in its history. India has always, if others have shown aggression, India has stood up, robustly and stoutly to that. But this is something which is sort of runs against India's DNA. India will be a very responsible leader. And maybe and through back channels will quite likely impress upon the whoever is the relevant stakeholder for course corrections if needed. But at this point, at least, actually, when I project from what has been India's DNA, this aspect will be something that will be consistent with India's DNA.
Right. Thank you. And just talking on that topic, just a follow-up question. Like, for example, if you look at a country such as Sri Lanka, most of the left-leaning parties have been sort of like pro-Chinese. So is it also in India's interest to like sort of globalize its economic model, like how it does with its digital payments? Would that be something interesting? Because you've had success in India, you want other countries to also follow through. So is that something like you all want to globalize your economic model? And also, just to this thing, we are seeing a rise in India's think tanks as well, like the Observer Research Foundation and others. So also sort of like dominate the global economic narrative as well.
So, it's interesting that you asked me this question. I would urge viewers to go and read one of the economic surveys that I had written. This is the 2019-20 economic survey. So if viewers Google economic survey 2019-20 India, they can go and check. It was on ethical wealth creation for a prosperous India. And there, the very first chart in that particular, in that survey was from Angus Maddison's book, incidentally, of the Oxford University Press, where Angus Maddison shows, so he documents from 180 till 2080, what was the contribution to world GDP of various countries. And up until 1750, so in other words, 3/4 of recorded economic history, India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP every year. On average, if you look at over that period, India's contribution to world's GDP would have been close to 45%, 42, 43%. I haven't done the average, but from having looked at that chart, I can sort of give this guesstimate in some sense. But important statistic, and this I'm absolutely sure about, every century, up until 1750, India accounted for at least 1/3 of world's GDP. Just to give you, a sort of a comparative benchmark, right? And we've been speaking about the United States. The United States has been the world leader for about, 3/4 of a century. During this period, its contribution to world's GDP on average has been about 27, 28%. So now compare, 17.5 centuries versus 3/4 of a century. That's a duration, huge, many times higher. At least 33% in every century for these 17.5 centuries versus about 28, 29%. This is a fact that very few people know, because most of us are so attuned to only looking at recent economic history. But this is, and I'm quoting from Angus Maddison's book, from economic history. The reason I'm bringing this up is that India became, that kind of global titan, economic titan, not due to happenstance. That kind of, dominance, economic dominance, doesn't happen per chance. It happens because of good thinking. And what was that good thinking? And that is basically what has been, explained, in detail in this economic survey. It was through the model of ethical wealth creation, not just wealth creation, which is, and the language that we used was marriage of the invisible hand of the market, the coinage that Adam Smith had. But, Indian philosophers like Kautilya, in the north, Tiruvalluvar in the south, have talked about private enterprise, about market economy, which is what Adam Smith basically used, the coinage as the invisible hand of the market. But these, without that particular terminology, has been used, the capitalistic enterprise has been used, and that was the model that India pursued. So the marriage of the invisible hand of the market with the hand of ethics. And that is what led to, to such wealth creation. The metaphor that I use to explain this is, think about a river, where water flows. When the rivers are well banked, the water flows into areas that need the irrigation, and it creates a lot of prosperity crops grow very well, when the banks are very well banked, when the river is very well banked. The same river, when the banks are broken, water goes helter-skelter and creates floods and enormous destruction. So think about the transaction, economic activity, that is basically the transaction, that's the flow of the water. Ethics is basically, think about those as the banks of that river. Without those banks, economic activity does not flow into the right areas and create prosperity. It goes and creates destruction sooner or later. And this is the message, from India's growth, from India's economic model, that is important for the rest of the world. It is not the model of what Wall Street Journal, for instance, in the 1980s had claimed, that greed is good. In the Indian, economic model, excessive greed is not something that is actually considered good, because it is excessive greed that leads to actually this bank of ethics essentially breaking down. And I think, research in the global financial crisis, my PhD advisor, Professor Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago, has done research showing that the global financial crisis was a failure of trust, among other things, of course. But this points out that, the model of rapacious capitalism, where we think and sort of worship greed as something that is good, is not one that will actually deliver sustained economic prosperity. It is indeed the marriage of the invisible hand of markets with the hand of ethics that is what will lead to sustainable and even, for instance, things like climate change, pollution. These are aspects that actually fit in very well in public goods, in externalities, negative externalities. All these come in, and those of you who are interested, these are all have been covered in that economic survey chapter. Once again, Google 2019-20 economic survey India. You will go to that page, and the very first chapter has these ideas, drawing from India's economic progress after 1991, which is recent evidence, and economics, dominance in its history, showing that it was basically the model of ethical wealth creation that led to this prosperity. So this is the model that India can teach the world, the entire world.
Right. Thank you. And now talking about moving on to innovation, just a question, because I wrote a piece for the International Monetary Fund where you compare that innovation and economic growth go hand in hand, because like before 200 years, there was no such thing as economic growth. Only after the Industrial Revolution, that's when India and China lost out to the West. So here again, when you look at manufacturing, India is a bit lagging behind. And, there was a clip I was watching, Mr. Raghuram Rajan, he was saying that India should sort of like should focus more on sort of R&D designing, because that's where most of the value addition is. So is any thing being done to gear India towards that in the manufacturing side? Yes.
So this is a good question. I had written about this again in one of the economic surveys. So if those who are interested can Google "Assemble in India for the World," and there all the evidence has been provided. So let's take a step back and understand the problems that have hobbled Indian manufacturing. So in 1991, India liberalized its product markets. So foreign companies could come and sell their produce, their services, goods and services in the product markets. But think about manufacturing. What are the inputs into manufacturing? When a manufacturing firm needs land, needs labor, needs power, needs logistics, transportation, and reliable transportation that happens, within a short period of time, reliable power, and it also needs to have the necessary scale so that its fixed costs can be spread over a reasonably large denominator, and finally capital as well. So financials, so these are the 6 inputs: land, labor, capital, power, transportation, and scale. These are the 6. Now, in these, even though India liberalized in 1991, each of these factor markets, that because these are factors of production in some sense, I'm being more expansive in, calling these are factors of production. Typically, economists would only think about labor and capital, but, from a manufacturing perspective, because these are all inputs, I'm thinking about those as factors, of production. each of these factor markets, liberalization was not done. Land was not, land reforms were not done. So the land markets are not competitive in India. Labor reform was not done. Labor markets, therefore, are not competitive either. Power sector actually was not reformed. Lots of discoms or companies which basically suffer losses because, again, price, there isn't competition and there isn't sort of a competitive market, too much intervention by the government. Infrastructure was not good. As a result, logistics costs were very high. It took forever to transport goods, and even then, not high quality. So maybe because the roads were not good, maybe products may break because of potholes and stuff like that. And because of the kind of regulations that we had, we basically incentivized dwarfs. What are dwarfs? Dwarfs are firms that grow in age, but they never grow. And economies of scale come when firms that are productive, they grow, and thereby reap economies of scale, reduce their average costs, and thereby become competitive, with the global peers. Now, in India, on each of these inputs, because we never reformed the factor markets, we have a situation where our manufacturing firms face anywhere between 15 to 20% higher costs, and that's a conservative estimate. In reality, the cost may be higher on each of these factor inputs. Now put these together. So capital is costlier, land is costlier, labor is costlier, power is costlier. It's costlier to transport, and the scale is actually not there because there are perverse incentives for firms to remain small despite aging. And all these cumulate and increase the costs. And this, to me, actually, and one of my key priorities when I assumed the office of Chief Economic Advisor, that it has been a policy failure. I spoke about the 2004 to 2014 lost decade. That was the period where, if you look at India versus China, China grew in double digits. And what did we do? We did nothing on any of these factor markets. When the government, let's say, when it got re-elected, I was quite optimistic that it has come back with a majority. I'm talking about in 2009, that it will actually implement some of these factor market reforms, will work on land, will work on labor, will work on power sector and all these other inputs. In contrast, what we got was actually a complete meddling with the financial sector, crony lending, that willful default and the likes. And we got instead a regulation that made ease of doing that business actually the other way, made the business even more difficult. For instance, let me point out a statistic. If you look at new business creation, and every economist recognizes that creative destruction, Schumpeterian creative destruction is actually is indicative, is sort of a very good indicator of the vibrancy of an economy. If you see from 2006 onwards, 2006 to 2014, in new firm creation in India grew at barely 4%. And because of the policy paralysis, and difficulty of doing business. In contrast, from 2014 onwards, new firm creation has grown at triple this rate at 12.5%. And that is the important thing that we have to understand, that unless policy focuses on making each of these factor markets competitive, manufacturing, nobody has a magic wand to actually wish manufacturing coming in. Policy has to actually be, take care of that. And I have absolutely no hesitation, and with supreme confidence, I can say that it was policy failures that actually led to Indian manufacturing being very, very poor. Since, in the last few years, many of these policy failures are being addressed, not fully yet, but, a lot of momentum has gathered. Labor reforms have been undertaken, instead of 40-odd labor legislations at the federal level. Now there are 4 labor codes, 2 of which have been actioned. 2 others are waiting for it to be actioned, but the legislation has been passed in Parliament. As I was mentioning earlier, infrastructure spending is focused on the power sector and logistics, within logistics, railways and roads, so that transportation can become easier. to reduce this phenomenon of dwarfism. The definitions for small and medium enterprises have been changed so that they can grow. And incentives that are given for firms actually to increase production, are based on them growing. The production-linked incentive has been given, it incentivizes growth precisely to address this phenomenon of dwarfism. And because there has been some criticism of the PLI, I must mention that in academia we can write academic papers where we say there is one equilibrium, bad equilibrium, and then there is a good equilibrium. In academia we don't then write down how that transition from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium happens. You can just sort of show two equilibria, but in policy, you cannot actually just assume the new equilibrium happening. You have to create that path from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium. The manufacturing sector that we had, because of the reasons that I explained, has been in a bad equilibrium. Reforms will create, of these factor markets, will create that good equilibrium, but that path has to be laid. By the time the good equilibrium comes, if none of the domestic firms are there to utilize the manufacturing, to do manufacturing, then what would be the point? Will there be political support for it? Absolutely not. And that is why the PLI scheme is that bridge from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium. I hope at least economists understand, and economists that actually have done policy will understand the importance of creating this bridge from the bad equilibrium to the good equilibrium. And that is what is really critical. So I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that manufacturing needs more work. There's been a lot of good policy measures that have been taken, but we still have a long way to go on some of the policy aspects, and we need to redouble efforts on that.
Right. Very interesting. And since we're running out of time, to my last question, India is set to be the third largest economy by 2027 and right now has the largest population. Do you think how far are we? I know India deserves a seat at the UN Security Council, a permanent seat, even a veto-wielding seat, but how do we attain that? What are your views on that?
So this is a question, Talal, that actually I don't really have the expertise to answer. I think our diplomats will be in a much better position to answer. As a citizen, if you ask me, to me it's a no-brainer. As the third largest economy in purchasing power parity terms, soon to be third largest economy in dollar-denominated terms, and likely to be the second largest and possibly the global titan in the economy, in the economic landscape. I think it seems a no-brainer.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Subramanian. Thank you so much for your time here. So it has been an absolute pleasure to speak to Dr. Subramanian, Executive Director of the IMF and the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Indian government. I wish to thank